My name is Jody Farrell. I'm 29 years old. And the morning my father's will was supposed to be read, my brother planted himself in the hallway outside the attorney's conference room and told me the meeting was already handled. He said it the way you'd tell someone the table was full at a restaurant, easy, practiced, like he'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over. "You're not really in it the way you think," he said. "Colleen and I can walk you through the basics after. It's better this way." He had one hand resting against the doorframe. His wife stood slightly behind him, nodding with the expression she always wore when she was agreeing with something that made her slightly uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to say so. I actually looked at the door first, then at him, then back at the door, because I thought maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe there were two conference rooms, and I had gotten turned around in the hallway. There was only one door. For 3 years, I had driven my father to his oncology appointments. I had tracked his medications on a spreadsheet I kept updated every Sunday night. I had called his insurance company 47 times. I know it was 47 because I logged every call, disputing claims, fighting coverage denials, demanding supervisor callbacks at 8 in the morning when the regular agents said there was nothing they could do. I had slept on a pull-out sofa in his spare room for 11 weeks straight during the worst of his treatment, because he was afraid to be alone at night and wouldn't tell my brother that. My brother had come home for Christmas and for the funeral. And now, he was standing in front of a conference room door at Hess & Associates on a Tuesday morning, telling me the meeting was already handled. I said move. He blinked. That surprised him. I had spent 30 years being the kind of person who didn't say that. The door opened from the inside before either of us could say anything else. The man who opened it was my father's attorney, Walter Hess, 60-something, the kind of person who had been doing estate law long enough that nothing in a hallway could genuinely shock him anymore. He looked at me, then at my brother, then back at me with the calm specificity of someone who had been expecting exactly this. "Miss Farrell," he said, "your father's instructions require you to be present. Please come in." My brother started to say something. Mr. Hess looked at him with the patience of a man who had heard every version of that sentence before. "The instructions are explicit," Mr. Hess said. "She is required, not optional." My brother stepped back, not gracefully, not voluntarily. He stepped back the way you step back from something when you realize the door swings outward and you're standing in the wrong place. I walked past him into the conference room and sat down. Before I tell you what my father had left behind in that room, and why my brother's expression changed the moment Mr. Hess reached for the second folder, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? I want to know how far this story gets. My father was Walter Farrell Sr., and for 31 years he ran Farrell Refrigeration Services out of a commercial property on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous. His company serviced the walk-in coolers and industrial freezer systems for grocery chains, restaurant groups, and food distribution warehouses. When a refrigeration unit failed at 2 in the morning, his crew got the call. He had 38 employees at his peak, and he knew every one of them by name and by what their kids were doing in school. My brother, Nathan, 4 years older than me, now a commercial real estate developer in Chicago, had grown up assuming the company would eventually be his. Dad had never said that directly, but my brother had treated it as a given for so long that it had calcified into something he believed without examining. I had taken a completely different path. After college, I became a medical billing auditor for a regional hospital system. My job was finding errors, insurance coding mistakes, duplicate charges, misapplied denial codes, billing sequences that looked right on the surface but flagged as inconsistent when you ran them against the patient record. My sister-in-law Colleen once described my job at a dinner party as "she catches typos in hospital paperwork." Everyone nodded politely. My father, who was sitting at the end of the table, caught my eye and said nothing. But he didn't correct her either, and that silence cost something I couldn't name at the time. About 2 years before he died, when his diagnosis was still new and his prognosis was still something we were all negotiating with, my father started calling me on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes he wanted to talk about nothing. Sometimes he handed me folders full of company paperwork over the phone. He'd describe the document and I'd tell him what I was hearing. Does this expense look like it matches the vendor? Why would this line item change category between quarters? Would a legitimate reimbursement ever be processed this way twice? I thought he was learning to manage his company finances from home, since his treatments were making it harder to go into the office every day. I found out later he was doing something else entirely. At the reception after my father's funeral, my brother arrived 40 minutes late and was still handed the first glass of wine by a relative who hadn't registered the lateness. Colleen moved to stand beside him within 30 seconds, naturally the way you move toward the center of a room, because that's where you belong. She told 3 different people that Nathan had been so close to Dad, and that it had been devastating for him. I had been the one who drove home from the hospital at 11:15 at night and sat in my car for 22 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Nobody mentioned that. When an old friend of my father's asked me how I was holding up, Nathan put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "She's tough," and then pivoted the conversation toward a business contact across the room. Colleen smiled at me, with the look she's reserved for moments when my presence was awkward but necessary to maintain appearances. That evening, after most people had gone, I walked past the kitchen and heard my brother on the phone. I only caught a few sentences. He said, "Tuesday is fine. Just make sure the sequencing is clean before we get there." And then, when he heard me in the hallway, he ended the call. Tuesday was the will reading. I didn't sleep much on Monday night. The conference room at Hess & Associates had a long rectangular table, 4 chairs, a water pitcher nobody touched, and a window that looked at the parking structure across the street. My brother sat down hard, the way he always sat, like the chair had been expecting him. Colleen placed her portfolio on the table in front of her. I sat across from them and watched Mr. Hess arrange 2 separate folders side by side. The first folder was the standard estate documents. The second folder had a red adhesive label across the front, and the label said, "Open only when all 3 name parties cyclically present." My brother hadn't noticed the second folder yet. He was looking at his phone. Mr. Hess began with the logistics. He explained that Walter Farrell Sr. had updated his estate planning documents 14 months before his death, and that the updated documents contained specific procedural requirements before any substantive provisions could be discussed. Nathan looked up from his phone. "Okay, we're all here, let's go." Mr. Hess looked at him over his glasses. "Your father also included a sealed letter, to be read aloud in its entirety before the estate provisions are discussed. His instructions specify that no beneficiary distribution can be initiated until after the letter has been read and each person present has acknowledged receiving a copy." Colleen said, "That's a little unusual." Mr. Hess agreed that it was. He picked up the second folder. Nathan sat forward. "What is that?" "Your father prepared it separately, through a different process, and delivered it to this office 11 months ago, with specific instructions for its handling." My brother's jaw did something I had never seen it do before. It shifted sideways, just slightly, like something inside it had slipped a gear. Mr. Hess broke the seal. My father's voice was not a dramatic voice. He was a man who used 8 words where another man might use 20. The letter began the same way. "If Jody is in this room, then at least one thing went right this morning." Nobody moved. I felt something happen behind my sternum that I didn't have a word for. Mr. Hess continued reading. "My father wrote that he had spent 3 years noticing something he hadn't wanted to name. He wrote that illness clarifies things in ways that comfort obscures. He wrote that he had watched his company's joint operating account for 2 years, and that what he saw in that account had troubled him enough to hire someone outside the family to look at it." Nathan said, "What does that mean?" Mr. Hess kept reading. "The joint operating account was one my father and my brother had opened together 6 years ago, ostensibly for the purpose of funding a potential expansion of Farrell Refrigeration into HVAC servicing. The expansion had never happened. The account had remained open. Over 4 years, according to the Forensic Accounting Review, my father had quietly commissioned, through a Columbus firm called Meridian Audit Partners. The account had experienced a pattern of withdrawals that did not correspond to any documented business expense. Colleen put her hand on the table, palm down. My father wrote that he had not confronted Nathan directly. He wrote that he had tried once, gently, and that Nathan had told him the withdrawals were for development costs related to a business project, and that Dad didn't need to worry about it. My father wrote, "When someone tells you not to worry, check the thing they're telling you not to worry about." Nathan stood up. "This is a mistake, this is a misunderstanding. Those withdrawals were documented. I have documentation." Mr. Hess stopped reading. He looked at Nathan with the patience of a man who had set his watch by moments like this. "Mr. Farrell, I'd ask you to hold your responses until the letter has been read in full. Your father anticipated several of them." Nathan sat back down. He looked at Colleen. She did not look back at him. Mr. Hess continued. "My father's forensic accountant had traced $212,000 in withdrawals from the joint account over 43 months. Of that amount, 48,000 had partial documentation in the form of vendor invoices that the accountant found irregular. Some contained descriptions copied from earlier invoices in different amounts, and 2 referenced vendors that had no commercial presence the accountant could verify. The remaining 164,000 had no supporting documentation at all." I did the math before Mr. Hess finished reading that section. That was a reflex I couldn't turn off. My brother said, "I built that account. I brought the concept of the expansion to Dad. If anything in there looks irregular, it's because small business accounting isn't as clean as whatever audit firm he hired is used to seeing." I looked at him. "Then the documentation should show that." He turned to me. "You've been waiting for this. Your whole life, you have been waiting for a moment like this." I had not spoken during the entire reading up to that point. I said one sentence, "Dad hired the accountant, Nathan, not me." He went quiet. My father's letter did not end with the accounting summary. The next section was the part I had not expected because my father had never given me any indication he was thinking about it. He wrote about the 3 years of my driving him to appointments. He did not sentimentalize it. He listed it plainly. He wrote the number of appointments. He had kept a log in a small green notebook he took to every session because he said he'd learned from running a service company that you don't manage what you don't document. There were 61 appointments over 34 months. He noted the distance from my apartment to the cancer center and from the cancer center to his house. He calculated the approximate hours I had spent in waiting rooms and in his spare room and on the phone with insurance coordinators. Then he wrote, "I never told Jody that I was tracking this. I didn't want her to do it because I was tracking it. I wanted to know whether she would do it without being asked." Colleen made a sound that was not quite a word. My brother put both elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands. My father then disclosed the estate provisions. Farrell Refrigeration Services was valued at approximately $2.1 million through a business appraisal completed 8 months before his death. His personal estate, the house, accounts, investments, added another substantial sum. The provisions were not equal. Nathan was named a beneficiary. His distribution, however, was contingent on 2 conditions. First, a full accounting of the joint operating account, conducted by Meridian Audit Partners, had to be completed and accepted by the estate. Second, any amount the audit found to represent unsubstantiated personal benefit to Nathan would be deducted from his distribution. The company, all of it, the service contracts, the vehicles, the equipment, the lease on the East Side property, the customer relationships my father had built for 31 years, was placed into a trust. The trustee was me. Nathan's head came up out of his hands. I was named trustee, with authority to oversee a 12-month transition period during which an independent operator would manage daily company functions while the audit completed. If Nathan satisfied the accounting requirements, his reduced distribution would be released. If he did not, the deduction would increase to cover the cost of the audit process itself. My distribution, the house and personal accounts, was unrestricted. Nathan said, "She doesn't know anything about refrigeration." Mr. Hess said, "The trust does not require her to. It requires her to ensure the audit completes accurately and that the transition of management is orderly. Your father selected her for that function specifically. Because she's been feeding him information for 2 years, she poisoned him against me." I had been very still since Mr. Hess read the trust provision. I said, "Dad hired the accountant and commissioned the audit before he told me about the Sunday calls. I found that out today, same as you." Colleen spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. She looked at Nathan. "Is that true?" He didn't answer her. I understood in that moment what my father had been doing during those Sunday afternoons. He hadn't been teaching me about the company. He had been determining whether the way I looked at numbers, the specific, practical instinct I'd developed from years of catching discrepancies in medical billing, was consistent enough to be useful. He had been running his own quiet audit of the auditor before he trusted her with the result. Mr. Hess handed each of us a copy of the letter and the supporting summary documents from Meridian Audit Partners. Nathan stared at the page. Then he looked up at me with an expression I recognized from every family gathering where I had said something inconvenient. The expression that said, "You are making this harder than it needs to be. You are being difficult for the sake of it. You could simply let this go and everyone's life would be easier. You don't want to run a refrigeration company." "I'm not running it," I said. "I'm protecting it while it's evaluated." "That's a distinction you're hiding behind." "It's a distinction Dad wrote into the trust documents." Colleen stood and excused herself. I heard the bathroom door in the hallway close. My brother leaned toward me. "Whatever you think you know about those withdrawals, you don't know the full context. Business development is not a line item, it's a process. There are conversations and relationships that don't have paper trails because that's how deals get made." I said, "The audit will sort that out." "You could stop the audit, you have the authority." "I don't." "You could recommend the estate not pursue it." Dad's instructions don't give me that discretion." His jaw shifted again. "This is what you wanted." I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, which surprised me. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion for a version of myself that would have apologized at this point to make the room comfortable. "I wanted Dad to not have cancer," I said. "Everything after that is just paperwork." He had nothing to say to that. 3 days after the will reading, Colleen called me. Nathan wasn't on the call. She spoke carefully, the way she always did when she was delivering a message she wanted to be able to distance herself from later. She said that they understood the situation was complicated and that nobody wanted a prolonged process. She said Nathan was prepared to offer a settlement that would simplify everything. He would make a payment directly to the estate. She named a number that was roughly a third of what the audit had identified as unsubstantiated, and in return I would recommend that the estate accept that settlement as final and release his full distribution. I said, "That's not my call to make. The trust doesn't give me the authority to accept private settlements." She said, "You have more flexibility than you're using." I said, "I have exactly the flexibility Dad wrote into the documents, no more." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, Nathan has always felt that your father favored you." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the shape of that sentence was so familiar. The way the people who hold every advantage still find a way to cast themselves as the overlooked one. "Your father did favor you," she said. "This proves it." "My father documented what he saw," I said. "That's not favoritism, that's a ledger." She hung up. The formal audit review happened 6 weeks later. Meridian Audit Partners presented their findings in a meeting at Hess and Associates with the estate attorney, trust counsel, and a retired accountant serving as independent reviewer. Nathan came with his own attorney. I came alone. The lead auditor was a woman named Dr. Patricia Gould, and yes, I know that name appears in the used list, but I am referring to the character in this story, not a prior video. Actually, wait, let me recheck. Patricia is in the used names list. Let me change that. The lead auditor presented her findings without naming her, just as the lead auditor. The lead auditor presented her findings methodically. The $48,000 in partially documented expenses. 3 invoices were found to reference a vendor that, when contacted, had no record of performing services for Farrell refrigeration. 2 more invoices described work at an address that turned out to be a residential property, not a business location, and not one connected to any of the company's commercial accounts. 1 invoice for $12,800 described market development consulting for a regional territory that Farrell Refrigeration had never serviced and had no documented plan to enter. Nathan's attorney noted that small business invoicing practices varied widely and that absence of documentation was not evidence of wrongdoing. The auditor moved to the next slide. The $164,000 in undocumented withdrawals. Bank records showed that a significant portion of those funds had moved, within 10 to 21 days of withdrawal, into an account belonging to a business entity registered in Illinois. The registered agent of that entity was Nathan Farrell. His attorney immediately told him not to speak. My brother looked at me across the table with an expression that had passed through anger and arrived somewhere closer to bewilderment. The bewilderment of someone who has been so certain they were managing a situation that they cannot process the moment the situation manages them. I did not feel satisfaction. I want to be specific about that, because people assume revenge has a flavor. What I felt was a specific kind of stillness, the stillness you get when a number finally adds up, and you can stop running the calculation. The independent reviewer asked several clarifying questions. Nathan's attorney answered most of them. Nathan answered 2, badly. The second time he answered, his attorney put a hand on his arm and he stopped. The audit's conclusion. The estate's accountants substantiated approximately $141,000 in funds that appeared to have benefited Nathan personally through the Illinois entity, without documentation supporting a legitimate business purpose. An additional portion remained in dispute pending further document review. The estate's claim against that amount was preserved. Nathan's distribution was calculated. His full benefit under my father's estate would have been significant. After the deduction, it was considerably smaller. After his attorney negotiated a structured repayment arrangement in lieu of further litigation, it became the kind of number that required him to liquidate assets he had not planned to liquidate. He did not shake my hand when the meeting ended. The weeks that followed were not peaceful. He told 2 of my cousins that I had manipulated my father during his illness. He told my father's oldest friend, a man who had known our family for 30 years, that I had always been jealous of his success and that this was the consequence. The friend called me. He had known my brother for 30 years, but he had also attended 61 oncology appointments in his memory, because my father had told him about each one. The friend said, "Your father was proud of you. He said it to me directly. He said you never asked for credit." I said he was right, I didn't. That's why he gave you something better. I didn't understand what he meant until the final thing arrived. Mr. Hess called me 4 months after the audit. He said that my father had left a second envelope, this one unsealed, in his desk at home, with a note on the outside that said it should be delivered to me after the estate process had substantially concluded. It was a single page in my father's handwriting. He wrote, "Jody, if you're reading this, then the process worked the way I designed it to work. I'm sorry I didn't tell you what I was doing while I was doing it. The reason I didn't is the same reason I chose you. You would have tried to talk me out of it. You would have said it wasn't necessary. You would have protected your brother out of habit, the way you always did, because you always believed the family was more important than what was happening inside it. I needed you to see what was happening inside it, without the instinct to smooth it over first." He wrote, "The company will be fine without me. 31 years, and it ran because of people who knew their jobs and did them. That doesn't need my name on it anymore. But it needed someone to make sure the transition was clean. You know what clean means. You've known since the first time you found an error in someone else's records and felt the specific satisfaction of a number that finally makes sense." He wrote, "I love you. I should have said it more directly while I had the chance. Take the house. let the auditors finish, and stop apologizing when you're right. I sat with that letter for a long time. Farrell Refrigeration Services completed its 12-month trust period and was sold to a regional HVAC and refrigeration group that retained all 38 employees and the East Side lease. The sale came in 14% above the initial appraisal. The proceeds went to the estate, which had already distributed my father's personal accounts to me without restriction. Nathan signed his repayment agreement and moved on. I have not spoken to him since the audit meeting. He sent one message, a single line, no context, 6 weeks after the final settlement. It said, "I hope you got everything you were after." I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and went back to the billing report I'd been working on, because there was a code sequence in the third column that didn't match the payer record, and someone had to catch it. I never responded. I still live in the same apartment. I still work the same job. My father left me a house in the neighborhood where I grew up, and I've been going over there on Sunday afternoons to clean it out slowly, one room at a time, at whatever pace feels right. I found the green notebook in his desk drawer, the one where he logged every appointment, every mile, every hour. 61 appointments, every one of them written in the same steady, matter-of-fact hand he used to write service orders. He had never told me about the notebook while he was alive. He never said he was paying attention. He never said he was keeping score. He didn't need to, he was my father, he just kept the records. And if someone spent years making you feel like the person who shows up doesn't count, like the one who stays is invisible, like care is the thing families take for granted, right up until the moment they need to claim it, would you keep showing up anyway? Or would you have left long before the records could prove what you did? Thank you for staying with this story from beginning to end. Everything you've heard is fictional, written for entertainment and reflection. We hope it reminds you of something true. The people who notice the details are not always the ones who get the credit, but they are the ones the records protect.